Very warm welcome to all of you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You are here in what used to be the press room. Very formal, somewhat stiff. And if you recall Foreign Affairs 20 years ago, the minister would be here. He would give a long expose, after which there were 3 polite questions, end of debate. That is exactly the opposite of what we aim to achieve here. What we're here to do as the PBL-academie and the National Platform Rio+20 is to really have you engage with 3 very eminent speakers and with someone who will respond to those presentations. I will introduce our panelists in a minute. And to make sure that you go home with new knowledge and that you are refreshed and engaged in the debate about the importance of sustainability in this world, in the world of tomorrow. My name is Kitty van der Heijden. I am the director here in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the department dealing with water, climate, energy and environment. That's about everything that is important for the next 100 years. And I'm also the ambassador for sustainable development, which means that I will lead the negotiations for Rio on behalf of the Netherlands. This was not an unimportant event for us. And we have struggled as civil servants, and that's why I reflect also not just on this room, but also on our positions. How do we prepare for Rio? How do we make sure that me as a civil servant, that I know what's out there? That I liaise with the knowledge institutions, that I liaise with business, with the NGO community, so I know what's there. And I can make sure that I go out there not as a civil servant in our usually ivory tower knowledge base, but that I go there refreshed and knowledgeable based on what you can contribute to the debate. So that's why we have established a national platform for Rio+20 in which we engage with the broadest subset of the Dutch society that I can manage to fit into these kinds of rooms. We have these discussions about every week, and I really ask you, engage with us, let me learn, and let me have the benefit of everything that you already know, that I need to know. What do you want me to get back from Rio? What do I have to take back in my suitcase to make sure that we deal with the challenges that global sustainability means? We have a very eminent panel of speakers. I am very, very pleased that Johan Röckström is here, the director of the Stockholm Environment Institute and Stockholm Resilience Institute. He is, I think he needs no introduction, very well known for his concept of planetary boundaries and how do we find a safe operating space for mankind in the future. He will kick off the presentations, followed by Maarten Heijer. I think in this room he will need no introduction. Maarten, the director of the Planbureau for the Leefomgeving, speaking at the English title, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, who has written extensively about the challenges for sustainability and who will ask us what are the next steps that we need to take as mankind. Then Frank Bierman, professor at the University of Amsterdam, will reflect, based on what Johan and Maarten have said, what type of institutional governance do we need to actually make sure that the changes materialize in the world of tomorrow? He has written a number of think pieces about that, and I really look forward to this governance issue, which is very often, I would almost say, under-addressed in the international negotiations. After that, I would like to ask Alex Evans from the Center for International Cooperation of New York University to quickly reflect on the 3 presentations, to entice you to engage with us in an interactive and lively debate. Alex, for those that don't know, is, I won't call him the ghostwriter, but let me say that he's very intimately engaged in the report of the Global Sustainability Panel, the panel that will advise Ban Ki-moon on the Rio process and beyond. So I really look forward to a lively debate. Please don't be polite. Make sure that you ask all these prickly questions that you always wanted to ask, but never dared to do. I now give the floor to Johan. It's my pleasure, Johan.
Thank you, Kitty. It's a pleasure to be here to make a scientific summary of the growing rift between what science indicates we need to do as humanity and what the political sphere considers today to be possible to do, and to do this in the context of what needs to be achieved in Rio from my perspective and from the network of scientists that we work with at SEI and the Stockholm Resilience Center. So it will be kind of a journey that summarizes the front of thinking on global change research, which also addresses this from the social dimensions, make the connections to the framework on planetary boundaries, but then ends up with a set of challenges for Rio. And it will be, so to say, summarized in a way in this couple of bullets. And I would like to emphasize, I think one of the dramatic realities for humanity right now is that we have not only a sense of urgency in terms of what has to happen very quickly in terms of a transition to global sustainability, but we have today a Sisyphusian dilemma that even though we're seeing progress in many parts of the world, we're seeing innovations and investments in renewable energy, we're seeing more and more efficient use of fresh water, we're seeing also a growing awareness of the need for change, it's eaten up by the sheer momentum of unsustainable development in many parts of the world. And we also see more and more evidence that the situation is new, and I'll try to make reference to why are we not in 1992 and why are we not in 1972 when the whole thinking around global environment development started with the Stockholm Conference and then end up with the key challenges. And of course the starting point is of course the notion and the realization that we are living on a increasingly crowded planet, 7 billion people committed to 9 billion people. And I made this reference yesterday at the meeting a couple of floors up here that we are subject to not one pressure, but what we've defined as a quadruple pressure on the planet. And generally these issues are discussed in isolation, but as we all know, they integrate. And the first part of this is, of course, the demographic challenge, which is not only about numbers, not only about the fact that we're committed to 9 billion people, but that we have an enormous equity and effluence challenge in the fact that it's the minority, the 20% that stepped onto the Industrial Revolution that has caused the major portion of environmental challenges we face today, and that we now have a positive momentum of development in large parts of Asia, South Asia, and even parts of Africa, and certainly in Latin America, aspiring to the right to development and also aspiring to larger ecological space. And this is one reason why we're kind of eating up much of the positive developments we're seeing, because on the aggregate, we end up 2010 with the largest ever greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. We have the climate challenge, which I won't go through too much on the science, just to say that we have reached essentially the threshold which the IPCC fourth assessment indicate as being an absolute maximum to be able to stay under 2 degrees, namely 450 ppm carbon dioxide equivalents. We're starting to see more and more science indicating that we have already committed ourselves to 2 degrees because of the cooling due to aerosols, and that we must rapidly stabilize at a much lower level, probably in the order of 400 ppm carbon dioxide equivalents, and that this will require us to quickly transition into a fossil fuel-free world in 2050. In Durban, the world is continuing its trench war, its unsuccessful trench war to try to come to anything close to an agreement that can take us towards a safe pathway. We won't succeed in Durban, even though we know we have to bend the curve by 2015. And we're not connecting it to the other crisis we have, namely the ecosystem crisis. That we have so much evidence to show that the last 50 years is an unprecedented period in human history in terms of undermining ecosystem functions and services. So the concern is that when we need a resilient planet the most to deal with the climate disturbance, we actually have the weakest planet, as far as we know, in the history of modern humans on the planet. Final squeeze is the growing insights from complex systems dynamic research, resilience research, that nature is not behaving according to our assumptions, namely the assumption being that ecosystems change gradually, linearly, and predictably. Instead, we're starting to see much, much more evidence that's the reverse, that surprise is the driving factor of change. Systems stay stable during long, long periods of use because they have an inherent ability to buffer disturbance and pressure, and then they can very rapidly tip over a threshold when feedbacks kick in and change state to states that generally are less conducive to economic development. So this is the new cocktail for sustainable development. It was partly articulated in Stockholm. It was certainly articulated in 1992, but the empirical evidence has only been really put on the table over the last decade, that this is such a large change in our agenda that, as Paul Crutzen suggested, we may have entered a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, where we humans constitute a geological force of change at the planetary scale. Science did a special issue on this very recently, showing key indicators of the Anthropocene, and I won't be talking more about the upper right-hand corner, so I'd like to just mention that to you, that apart from the warming crisis we're facing in climate change, we have the ocean acidification backside of the climate envelope, which is the global climate chemical crisis, that we're starting to see a very rapid acidification in the world's oceans, and that we can no longer exclude a future where we see tipping points in large parts of the tropical coral reef systems because acidification rips out carbonates, which tears apart the Lego blocks for all marine life, namely calcium carbonate. So we're starting to see true ripple effects as science learns more of tipping points. We gathered a whole group of Nobel laureates and global change scientists in May this year to address this issue of what are we really facing for Rio in terms of what is science telling policymakers and decision makers in the world. This ended up in what we call the Stockholm Memorandum, and the top point statement there is I think, a very strong and important change of the agenda. Science communicating that we may have reached a saturation point in terms of human pressure on planet Earth, that we are hitting hardwired boundaries at the planetary scale beyond which we can no longer exclude surprise, where we can no longer exclude dramatic catastrophic change occurring fast, destabilizing the Greenland ice sheet, destabilizing the Arctic ice cover, changing the monsoon systems, etc. But also making clear that climate change is not the only global process we need to be concerned of. Instead, we need to look at integrating processes across a broad area of environmental processes. But interestingly, this group of scientists indicated that we have a lot of evidence to suggest that a great transformation is in fact necessary, but also possible in terms of meeting global sustainability targets in the future. We see this eating itself or coming across much more closer in the policy and business domain. We normally see this kind of front pages in media corresponding or communicating to business in terms of the vortex and turbulence in the financial sector. The Economist, following on our Nobel Symposium, had this front page, welcoming humanity to the Anthropocene. This is, I think, a very significant reminder that this awareness of a new situation is in fact being understood more and more broadly. The Economist in this issue made the typical British understatement as well, that we need to take science seriously by saying that when reality is changing faster than theory suggests it should, a certain amount of nervousness is a reasonable response. and this is a typical Economist type phrase, wouldn't you agree, Alex? But it also is, I think, a fair representation of where we are, that science is concerned not only because of the empirical evidence of what's happening in terms of pressures, but also surprised itself in terms of how things are happening faster with larger impact than we had predicted earlier. This, I think, is an extremely important report that the IPCC released just a month ago or so, showing now that science indicates that extreme weather events we're seeing around the world, from the Australian droughts followed by the unprecedented flood, the Bangkok largest natural disaster ever in the modern history of Bangkok, Russian forest fires, etc., cannot be explained without coupling it to anthropogenic climate change. And we're starting to see more and more global climate modeling looking like this, where if we look at the longer term and the triggers that we define today can play out in feedbacks in the long-term future, meaning that we may be approaching a branch point in terms of warming where the Earth system may be, to say, at the branch point of whether it will be possible at all to stay under 2 degrees, or whether we may be propelling ourselves in a runaway situation towards 4, 5, 6 degrees warming, which is, as you all know, an envelope of warming which is larger than the last 55 million years. So what we do today matters for the very, very long term because of the triggering effects that we might be unleashing. So the evidence behind all this very urgent communication comes out of robust empirical observation. And it is all summed up very nicely from the IGBP synthesis from 2004 with the hockey stick patterns on essentially all the key parameters that matter for human well-being, all the way from carbon dioxide in the upper left-hand corner to the most dramatic in the lower right-hand corner, the loss of biodiversity on planet Earth. And it's interesting that all of these have exactly the same pattern. They branch in the mid-1950s, the point of the great acceleration of the human enterprise. So up until the 1950s, we see quite limited impacts at the global system. but we take off 10 years after the Second World War. We're 3 billion people, and that's where we put in the overgear in terms of going to scale with industrial metabolism. We also see more and more disciplinary science indicating that we need to bend these curves in this decade to avoid the tipping points and feedback mechanisms that might occur further on in the century to come. For example, on climate change, that we need to bend the emissions curve no later than 2015. So it is a very decisive moment right now when we meet in Rio next year, where we decide how the Earth system will be responding over a long period of time. You could argue then that, well, did we know this in 1992? Did we know this in 1972? Well, in fact, in 1992, a lot of the empirical evidence was there, but it was not synthesized as a comprehensive picture of all the, let's say, processes looking in this way. And it is only over the last 5-6 years that we have the full picture on the table. These exponential developments are, of course, matched by social equivalents. And I could show a whole battery of these, being energy use, and in this case, water use. And I think this is the most relevant one, which shows the exponential growth of people suffering from water scarcity on planet Earth. 3 billion people today suffering from water scarcity. And the dotted lines here show our efforts of exploiting and withdrawing and storing fresh water. So despite tremendous engineering efforts, and we are in the champion country in the world when it comes to managing fresh water, despite all that fantastic effort, we're still in a world where almost half of the world's population suffer from water scarcity. And water is so relevant, as you know, because global change impacts first on fresh water. Then, so that's on the drivers. So then you need to couple this with the risk of nonlinear change and tipping points. And I won't go through that much in detail, just to show you 3 examples of big systems where we now have scientific evidence that tipping points are occurring or even may have occurred in big systems. In the upper right-hand corner is our own research in the Baltic Sea, where we now show evidence that global warming, eutrophication, overfishing has flipped over the entire Baltic Sea region, roughly in 1989, from a low-nutrient, cod-rich, oxygen-rich system to the anoxic, fish-dead, algal bloom frequent system we have today. The Arctic shows the same pattern. In the black line here you see the very big concern that we saw in 2007 with a sudden 30% loss of summer ice cover in the Arctic. A total surprise to science. 2011 shows the same bottom position, and we're starting to see a worry among scientists that this may in fact be a tipping point because the feedback is so well known. The feedback being, as you know, the change in albedo and the reflectivity when ice melts and you get a darker surface. So you get a self-reinforced warming. Carlos Nobres and his colleagues show the same risk for the Amazon rainforest, that we can no longer exclude the Amazon tipping over into a savanna state due to warming and growing turbulence from deforestation. So we're starting to see evidence that we may be seeing abrupt changes occurring much more rapidly than we previously thought. So our question was then, well, what happens scientifically when you combine these 2 insights? The insight of the Anthropocene, the pressures on the system, now reaching an exponential point at the very high level, with the insight that we can no longer exclude catastrophic regime shift. This is, by the way, based on a synthesis by Martin Scheffer, who is a famous Dutch ecologist, as most of you certainly know. And this was what led us to explore how can we serve humanity with a better framework to guide human development in the Anthropocene. And this became the Planetary Boundaries framework. And what we did then was to try to ask ourselves, what is then the desired state of planet Earth that we do not want to lose? We don't want to see the system as a whole flip out of its stability domain. And we believe it's quite easy today to define our desired state, which is illustrated in this picture, which shows ice core data from Greenland over the past 100,000 years with a good proxy for living conditions, which is temperature variation. 100,000 years is a good period. Normally we see this data going back 800,000 years, you know, the classic Vostok ice sheet, ice core data. But this is a relevant period because it's roughly half the time we've been fully modern humans on planet Earth. So we've had the same, to say, ability, intellectually and physically, to build civilizations as we know it. And as we also know, this was a jumpy ride indeed for humanity. We had tremendous variability in conditions on planet Earth. We were hunters and gatherers. We were very few people, 20 to 40 million people, we had, to put it simply, a rough time. In fact, the lowest point right here, DNA-based archaeologists show that that is probably the point when we left Africa the last time. We were possibly down to 15,000 fertile adult human beings at that point. That cold point meant that fresh water was bound up in the Arctic and the Antarctic. You could probably walk over the Red Sea, and drought pushed humans out to Asia and then back to Europe in a crisis point. We enter the Holocene, we barely enter it, and we go through our first revolution. We invent agriculture, we domesticate animals and plants, and off we go into the civilizational journey as we all know it. We reached 3 billion people in the Great Acceleration. We're 7 today, committed to 9. So our conclusion was that the Holocene is the only state we know that can support the modern economy as we know it. And therefore, it simplifies the agenda for Rio, because we know the Holocene quite well. Temperature varies plus minus 1 degree. Carbon dioxide varies with a known range. Nitrous oxide the same, methane the same. We have quite good picture of the biogeochemical conditions for planet Earth to stay within the Holocene state. We also know it's in the Holocene that the planet stabilizes in terms of the biomes as we know them, the grasslands, the wetlands, the rainforest, the temperate forest, and therefore the whole richness in terms of the biosphere supporting our development. So this we took as our reference point and asked ourselves the questions then, what are the Earth system processes we need to be stewards of to remain in the Holocene? And for each of those processes, can we identify the risk of thresholds that could jeopardize the Holocene state, and even find control variables for these and quantify a point where we reach into a danger zone which may push us into thresholds. And if we do this, you could define safe boundaries within which we can have a safe operating space for human development. And this led to the Nature 2009 paper, which was authored by a group of 20+ global change researchers from all disciplines, where we suggested quantified boundaries for 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries that this group identified, which allows us to do what, for example, this nature figure illustrates, namely that we have possibly, or most likely, transgressed the safe boundary for climate, biodiversity, and nitrogen. And this is one way of providing a new guiding point for human development in the Anthropocene. So that was the purpose of this research. And using this, I think, is an illustration of the changing agenda for Rio. I'll just close by showing a couple of interactions between the boundaries and then suggest what must then be resolved in Rio. One way of illustrating why the boundaries are so important and why we, in that paper, suggested that you need to stay within safe boundaries for all of them, because otherwise they'll be jeopardizing its neighboring boundaries, is illustrated here. This is our emissions of greenhouse gases in terms of carbon dioxide over the past 50 years, from 4 billion tons to 9 billion tons. And as you know, we've increased temperatures with roughly 0.8 degrees so far since the Industrial Revolution. And you would believe that it's this area under the curve, because carbon dioxide lives 1,000 years in the atmosphere, that has contributed to warming so far. And as you know, that's not the case. Oceans and land ecosystems have absorbed roughly half of our emissions, providing the world's largest free ecosystem service. The absorption in the oceans, by the way, driving ocean acidification. Now, the interesting thing with this is, apart from the fact that the planet is therefore our best friend, it is doing its uttermost to support humanity when we disturb its climate system. Look at the change over the past 50 years. Science indicates that the planet has actually doubled its carbon sink over this period. Now, this is an indication that resilience theory holds at the Earth system scale. The planet is behaving as the theory stipulates. It's trying to stay in equilibrium. It's trying to remain in its Holocene equilibrium state. The trick is that science increasingly shows that this ability may be undermined, both in terrestrial ecosystems and in ocean, that we cannot count on this capacity to increase in the future, showing the interactions between boundaries. So what does all this mean then finally for Rio? Well, one thing is, very simply, that we need to integrate closer the 3 Rio Conventions from 1992. You could argue a bit harshly that perhaps the final battleground, whether we'll be able to stabilize climate at 2 degrees, is moving away from emission reductions to sustainable stewardship of our biosphere. that it's in the ecosystems and their ability, continued ability to be carbon sinks, that will be the real decisive point. But we also must now recognize the very, very different agenda from 1992, that science can now support policy by saying that the following statement holds: global sustainability is a prerequisite for local development. That global sustainability is now necessary to be able to be successful even at the village level, the community level, the business level, the nation level. That has not been on the agenda so far. We've not been forced to say that Agenda 21 is not enough. We now need to and depend on meeting global sustainability goals at the larger global scale. Now we're seeing this playing out in very many areas, and the two areas that we've been discussing, not least yesterday with colleagues at PBL, is that one fast-track area for Rio is an energy transition. Because if we would succeed with a global sustainable energy transition, looking at particularly access for all, we would tick off large parts of the climate challenge, but also meet very many of the social development goals, and at the same time be able to also support spin-off effects on many of the other sustainability areas. And this is just illustrated on the tremendous hockey stick also in terms of energy use per capita over the past 100 years. The second area, which I believe is an interesting fast-track area, is going from unsustainable food production to sustainable agriculture in the future. Because if we would be able to do that transition, which science increasingly also shows is possible, we would probably be able to accomplish very much of the biodiversity challenge, the nitrogen challenge, freshwater challenge, and phosphorus challenge. And this paper in Nature recently showed that you can actually feed the world in a sustainable way by 2050. So energy and agriculture seems to be promising areas to kick off with also for Rio. Well, we've already referenced the Ban Ki-moon panel. I think it's an interesting initiative. We may come back to that in the discussion. And I'll jump this one just to come to the absolute final concluding remarks then. So what would be my summary? Well, the first one is that a roadmap to attain the UN Millennium Development Goals and sustainable prosperity in Anthropocene is a necessary part of Rio, of course. And we cannot allow ourselves to make Rio just a meeting about development. It has to be about lifestyle change and behavioral challenges for all nations on the planet. We will have to address planetary governance in a much more profound way. If we are in the Anthropocene, and if we are hitting absolute boundaries at the planetary scale, then we need to strengthen governance also at the global level. It's not to say that polycentric institutions and bottom-up initiatives are not important, but we certainly need to strengthen from the top as well. We need to address the triple subsidy of conventional economic growth, that we are subsidizing economic growth through ecological space, we are doing it through the social inequities, through labor costs across the world, and we're doing it in the financial sector, simply living on credit in the future, and this has to somehow be part of the green economic development agenda. We need to recognize that business as usual is not an option, that transition pathways and transformations is the real challenge. There's nothing less than an industrial revolution needed around the corner. I think it's worth supporting the Colombian government's suggestion of defining global sustainable development goals. And as I mentioned, a global energy transition, a global agricultural transition are both interesting, possible, and I think priority areas. The green growth strategies need to break, finally, the perceived dichotomy between growth and sustainability. And I'll close there by simply, it's so remarkable that already in 1972, it was stated clearly that environmental sustainability is the basis for human development. And 2011, we're still seeing a discourse that it's either sustainability or growth. And I just find that so depressing. And of course, if the Dutch platform and many other countries in the world can work together to once and for all kill that dichotomy, I think that would be a great achievement. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, of course, the points just raised by Jon Rockström are so profound and so encompassing that you wonder why we have such difficulty in actually acting upon that knowledge. And that is precisely what I think I would like to add to the discussion today. Where is our capacity for reflexivity in this world where we can talk about planetary problems, but obviously have to cope without having a planetary government? I think the Rio+20 conference is in a way a misnomer, because it's much more useful and much more obvious to think about it in terms of 40 years of global environmental diplomacy, starting in Stockholm in 1972. And very much at that conference we coined the phrase "only one Earth." That was the moment at which this planetary awareness became center and focus of our effort to first initiate that what we now call global environmental diplomacy. But obviously the string of conferences that we've seen since have not been able to deliver the results that would have avoided Johan having to give the presentation he just gave. I mean, look at the achievements that we actually can look towards after Rio, the conference in '92. The forest area is going down, the undernourished people are going up, and the CO2 emissions are not under control. We have some progress in creating institutions that we need, but only very moderately and definitely not of the scale that is needed to act upon the challenges that Johan just sketched. And there's very little results on the ground and a very rapidly changing context. So if we want to think about Rio and what Rio should achieve, we have to consider what went wrong, what prevented the world community acting upon that cognitive moment that was basically the moment of 1972. So it seems as if the Stockholm conference was the start and the Copenhagen conference was the one that will make it to the history books, the one where we thought, because it was a media event like no other conference in the environmental field before, we thought we were going to see a global agreement, and we did not get it. But the jury is still out as to why we don't work with a treaty that we wanted to sign. Is it the sudden shifts in geopolitics? Is it that it was basically showing the limits to an environmental global diplomacy? Was it, as some people argue, the start of a new and very powerful discourse of governance that says no binding treaty, but pledges that countries can act upon and will stimulate each other to reach the goals nevertheless? Or is it that we have to start to think about new agents of change, not only nation states, but very much also NGOs and the business community? Should they be brought much more into focus when we try and achieve the incredible transformation trajectories that we just were told about? We don't know, the jury is still out, and nevertheless we prepare for Rio. And I think in that sense it is useful to consider the perspective of a global risk society as put to words by our colleague Ulrich Beck, who I collaborated with in Germany in the 1990s. He speaks about a global risk society and says, our society is run by the unintended consequences. It is not run by decision-making centers. It is run by the unintended consequences of producing growth. And it is the endless government efforts to try and come to grips with these unintended consequences that is the name of governance. He goes so far as to speak about an organized irresponsibility, that not having the institutions in place that can meet the challenges that we just saw presented is actually a matter of organized irresponsibility, because we know these facts. We don't need more science about where these limits are. We need a different sort of science and a different sort of institutions that actually address these issues. Or we decide not to, but then of course we have to realize what may lie ahead for us. We keep producing too little too late. There is a structural policy failure that we have to discuss when we talk about what we want to get from the Rio+20 conference. So yes, pointing out planetary boundaries is crucial, but that discourse of limits can only be the starting point of a more encompassing scientific and policy endeavor that we need to get into order before June next year, just to be ambitious. It's crucial, a discourse of limits, but in itself pointing them out won't produce the change we need, that is what we can safely say after 40 years of global environmental diplomacy. So what is that global reflexivity going to be about? It is about indeed showing these limits, but it must also be about showing the potentials. What is there in this planet with all its creativity, its ingenuity, its potential for innovation that can actually be a trajectory, a pathway towards what we like to call a clean economy and a just society. That is a pair. We should think about these as a pair. Limits and potentials should be part of the same scientific endeavor. Show also much more the potential unintended consequences, because we know about lock-ins, we know about side effects, we know about rebound effects. If we invent LED light, we know that that is a factor 10 more efficient way of using energy to light your rooms. But if, of course, architects think, well, that's a nice tool to light my buildings, or if citizens think that's a nice way to light my garden, then the net effect of using these new innovations will actually be nil or actually be negative. So, not addressing the issue of lifestyle effects, look at the protein puzzle that PBL published, is actually a very problematic way of starting on a discussion. But of course, discussing lifestyles is just as problematic, because what is the authority of one part of the scientific community, of the community at large, to say that we don't want others to reach certain ways of caring for their diets that we, for instance, in the West already have. I'll touch upon that later on. So be aware, I would say, as a political scientist here, be aware of that knowledge-power nexus. The way in which you make a sum is often implicitly hinting at a particular political solution. We have to be very careful about that. There's a large group of people that need to be acting to avoid the mishaps that Johan sketched out, but that might actually require us to talk about the science in a different sort of way. Ways in which particular traditions of thinking co-produce particular policy regimes. I mean, it is not always so that big problems are best taken on by big government. We may actually have to look for different governance structures that do indeed obviously include treaties and nation states, but are directly from the start also taking into account what society itself can do. Going to Rio, we should, I think, be much more aware that whenever we try and think of it being one equation, that might in itself be a particular framing of the situation. We live in a world which we should understand as a world of coexisting realities. We live in a world in which all sorts of countries discover the potentials of a green economy, but at the same time invest massively in new fossil fuel plants. These worlds cannot both exist if we want to avoid the difficulties that Johan sketched in the previous presentation. We can think about providing cleaner energy for 1 billion of people without electricity at the moment, but if that policy endeavor coexists with launching mega city developments for millions of people in desert situations, that will cancel each other out. This is what is actually occurring right now. We are moving towards a massive urbanization, not only of mega cities, but also of medium and small cities. And the ecological concerns for these cities are not in place. We're building them very much with 20th century technologies that the West exports to developing countries, whereas we realize that if we don't make the sum become ecologically sound in these new cities, we will never reach the goals that we need to reach, as the science has provided us a long time ago already. Land use, transport, all these things need to be taken into account, and we have coexisting realities right now. Now, there are two things we know about the agenda for Rio. It's fighting hunger and poverty, and it is the green economy. And we want to combine these two perspectives in an intelligent way. Now, if we talk about the green economy, I think it is important to realize there is a variety of perspectives that is dealt with under that heading of a green economy. We should understand much better what these potentials are. To what extent can it be indeed a corporate endeavor that produces a green economy? To what extent is actually there something to be gained by combining directly the poverty issue with the green economy issue? What sort of potentials do they have for these many issues of the planetary boundaries as were addressed previously? That's a scientific question. We need to investigate it much better. Now, obviously, this is sort of a 10-year agenda, and we can't do that in a mere couple of months. But what we can do is sketch out a few elements that we as PBL want to contribute to this process in the exercise we are currently undertaking. And I will single out two elements of that challenge. It's called the Rio+20 project, and it is very much organized to contribute to a vision for development by exploring future pathways. So not exposing the limits, but showing what sort of pathways we should be looking towards, because that's what policymakers need to be aware of. What is needed to achieve a set of ambitious sustainable development targets by 2050 simultaneously? What pathways would be consistent with achieving these targets? What do long-term targets imply for near-term policy priorities? And what is the needed institutional framework and governance mechanism for that? Now, I'll discuss briefly two thematic clusters that are part of that: the Foodland Biodiversity Nexus and the Energy, Climate, Air Pollution Nexus. Now, the exercise is a backcasting exercise. So we take a reality of 2050 where we reach sustainable development goals, and we combine that with looking at the expected trends that we can extrapolate from what we see occurring around us. And we have a challenge scenario that actually shows us what the transformative action and policy making package is that we need to have in place. And we can then also look, what do we need to do in the next 10 years? Now look at the land issue. The land issue must be about food security for all. So how can we feed these 9 billion people in 2050? And how do we do that in such a way that it doesn't go to the detriment of the biodiversity? Because we know the inclination will be to make more land available for agriculture, and that will then further push these graphs about the loss of biodiversity downwards. Now, there is one big obvious solution or trajectory that you want to take into consideration. How can we enhance the productivity of the land that is available? And we need to do that in a very big way. It's a new green revolution type of enhancement of productivity that is needed in order to avoid that we are going to extend the use of land that is now biodiversity rich and would then be used for agricultural purposes. So there is an incredible need to talk about yield increase, and that yield increase is in order of magnitude. We have seen 1.5% of yield increase per annum, and we have to beef that up way further. So maintain, in terms of a governance issue, maintain the agricultural productivity increase. Think about research suitable for the developing countries. Here the Netherlands can indeed play a fantastically important role. We have done that always. We should use that as something we bring to Rio, that we, with our very rich research universities, give that potential to other countries, also knowing how you build up relationships with these countries and with farmers based on years and years of our university-based research. Think about diffusion of techniques and management techniques. It's not only about instruments, it's often about management techniques that will allow this to work. And produce also an idea about sustainability for large-scale farming. It cannot only be on a small scale, then you have not within reach that yield increase that we are looking towards. Obviously, at the backside, if we can reduce the amount of land we need for our proteins, we have a double success. So if we know that red meat requires 10 times more land for that proteins than other types of protein diets, that is, of course, something we put to the policy-making circle as an option to consider. It's for politics to make decisions. It's for us to show options. Sustainable diets are an important way to think about that challenge. And let's not forget, there is no global natural appetite for red meats. If you look at the research, the rural, the agricultural, sociological research, it shows that red meat is a diet that's exported to other parts of the world. It's part of a trade politics, and it is not as if the highest level of welfare is eating red meats per se. That's a Western interpretation of welfare. So the issues for governance here: improve the function of the world and local food markets. We can still make that work much better. Think, of course, about efficiency losses. Think about increased incentives for production increases and changes in a local market situation. And also take into consideration restricting speculation in markets considering food and scarce resources. There is quite a bit of evidence that actually there is speculation in markets considering food, but also in other scarce resources. There's again a policy option you want to take on board if you are serious about this issue of providing diets for everybody in the world in 2050. Manage competing claims on land is of course highly topical and very difficult, but should also be part of the Rio agenda. Now, the second is the energy challenge, much more familiar territory, I suppose, for most of you. We know what the scenario should be, and what we do, also in collaboration with the Stockholm Institutes, is think about sustainable energy sources for all. That is something where we realize that at the moment we project in 2030 1 billion people will still live without electricity, and 2.8 billion people still depend on solid fuels. That's the world we're looking towards, and that's the world we can't afford ourselves, and we might not want to have anyway for ethical and other reasons. If we want to stay within the 2-degree target, again we need to act on this, because the business as usual scenario goes to 4 degrees in 2100. And again, let's not forget there is a very big relationship between the climate issue and the air pollution issue. If the bottom 2 billion still use kerosene lamps, that is actually a very bad situation for domestic health, and is something you want to address in its own right. Now, can it be done? Yes, it can be done. This is just a scenario, and it shows you the different policy options you have to take into the equation in order to achieve that reduction that we need to have. But it is basically everything you have in your pocket. It is about CO2 capture and storage. It's about bioenergy. It's about solar. It's about nuclear. Or it is, if it's not about nuclear because we don't want nuclear, we have to use more biomass. There is no friendly story in this perspective. If we want to reach it, every single cannon has to be rolled towards the front. And the emission intensity has to go way up for us to capture the energy we need in a way that is sustainable. Looking at the traditional energy use, we have to do something about the fact that still 1.8 billion use basically firewood or coal in a situation where that is actually not what you want to do. You have to think about a massive investment in improved stoves. You have to think about new combinations of green light that might help them avoid using these resources, and that are, as we all know, not at all sustainable. So the main issues for the coming 10 years: create a policy coherence. If everybody in Western Europe goes for biomass, it's not likely that we will be able to generate that biomass in a sustainable way. It will be to the detriment of other countries. So how are we going to do that? Who sets these policy targets so that we don't, 10 years on the road, see that they were not sustainable? Consider perhaps, in the light of the double agenda of Rio about poverty and the green economy, a massive outreach for the bottom billions, where you would indeed try and do something about the way they cook, the way they light, and indeed do something immediately to alleviate their poverty. Think about secure sufficient investments. Where is the R&D going? We still need more R&D. It's not only about implementation. But if we don't spend it in the niches where we need to spend it, then that will actually hit us later down the road. Infrastructure for renewables and an energy access is something we need to think about right now. It takes a long time to get the infrastructure in place, and time is short. If these emission reductions don't start in 2020, we realize we are too late. Now, to conclude, the governance challenge. In this already is a story about what we need to do on these policy issues. That shows you how difficult it's going to be and how almost unlikely it is that we are going to agree on a set of policy measures in Rio. So if Rio is not going to be about the solution, then we need to have that process in place that kickstarts that transition. Because we do indeed, if you look at the data long enough, you realize we look towards a totally new way of producing and consuming. It's not going to be the 20th century. It's going to be an entirely new industrial park that we're looking towards, and otherwise it won't work. So if the OECD coins green growth, realize it's about a competitive endeavor. It is not for everybody. It is looking what countries could gain by going in a green growth strategy and be competitive against others. But the interesting thing about that OECD perspective is that it suggests that competing might be used to reach green targets, rather than that it is about controlling the economy. This is a very important discourse. Western governments, of course, run the risk of getting caught between citizens and businesses here, because some businesses might want to go, but some citizens don't want to have their windmills. They don't want to have their CCS. So government is in a very difficult situation, and if it doesn't commit itself and show persuasively that it has a story, that is a perspective for society as such, is going to have difficulties, which will mean that for electoral reasons, they won't go for a green ticket. And that is, of course, what needs to be prevented if you take seriously the 2050 challenges. The BRICS in themselves are also caught in a double logic. They fight against poverty. It's not, they might be gaining ground on the OECD countries, but nevertheless, the BRICS, of course, still have a poverty problem of incredible magnitude. And you see these existing realities together and not in one uniform logic. It's a double logic of a high energy urban growth combined with a very basic and important fight against poverty. Different countries we see use greening as a vehicle for a benign competition. I find that very interesting and important. So South Korea is basically exporting a generation of production equipment to Southeast Asia, thus raising the level of productivity in Vietnam, but of course freeing itself for yet another generation of production or indeed services in their economy. It's a very interesting model for a green economy, but it's not going to be agreed in Rio. It's already happening. Germany, China, Denmark, they are actually thinking about the green economy in terms of an industrial revolution. They are going to win money by doing this. It's a combination, which we don't know in the Netherlands, between industrial policy and environmental policy. It's a very potent discourse to take into account. And it's all very clear that it will only work if you use the relationships between government and business and NGOs. It's about extended negotiations. It's not about nation states only. And in the Energetic Society, the report the PBL published, which is very much on a Dutch situation, but nevertheless has, I think, international relevance as well, we suggest look more towards society as an agent of change. And look what the state can do to help societal actors produce these public goods. Realize that regulatory state mechanisms are very powerful. We know from the past that the European Union Euro norms for combustion engines have produced innovation. Don't forget about the power of regulation. Don't optimize, but create the incentives that will kickstart innovation. So let yourself be surprised by society by giving the perhaps fiscal incentives that make people work for you, and improve on the monitoring and feedback so that this society is going to learn and learn and learn. Now, Rio is close by. You first heard the planetary boundaries that were talking about a geological time axis, and now we're talking about a mere couple of months. These two don't sit too well together. But at least facing some of these facts about what that transition pathway might look like gives us also a policy focus that is relevant for policy making, should be on the agenda, I think, in Rio in June. Thank you very much.
I think my presentation is very much in line with the two previous presentations. We have learned from Johan Röckström that there are planetary boundaries and that they are threatened to be violated by human activities. And we learned from Martin Heyer that we need to energize and have an energetic society in our governance systems and also our global governance systems. So my talk, the third in this series, is about the global level. My talk is about world politics in the Anthropocene. And I like very much this slide, and you see here, scientists now agree the planet is being pushed past its sustainable boundaries. Are we listening? I think all of us are listening because this is why we are here. But the question is, are the diplomats and the politicians who are attending the Rio conference, are they listen to these presentations on planetary boundaries and all these problems? And what are the frontiers? What is the way forward in the systems of global governance that we have to address all these issues that have been presented previously? And this is a talk that I want to deliver. I want to present in particular on the responses from the scientific community. The scientific community is organizing in March next year a major conference in London. It's called Planet Under Pressure. It's the biggest science conference in the last 5 years, if I'm not mistaken. And the timing of this conference is, of course, in line with the Rio conference. It's meant to be as a startup. It's meant to assess the scientific research that we have today and play the ball forward to diplomats in June in Rio, that they can then take action based on the scientific findings that we have. And for this purpose, the scientific community came together and has developed 9 policy briefs, very short, policy-relevant, state-of-the-art on what we know about health, what we know about food, what we know about energy, and there's also one policy brief on the institutional framework on sustainable development, where people came together to develop ideas about what is the state of our knowledge on the scientific, on the social sciences, and what are the reform options. And this was a team of 30 people that have published this policy brief, because it is an outcome of this conference. It's already been prepared now. And the main finding of this group of 30 authors who worked for quite some time on this policy brief is that what we need is transformative change. And this is one of the findings that emerge in discussions with kind of pretty conservative social scientists sometimes, who are not used to adopt these big picture languages, who are used to write incremental papers about incremental change in politics. But in the discussion that we had, in discussions with NGOs and also UN representatives, the common finding is what we need is really a structural change in the way how we conduct global governance today. Incremental change is not the way forward. And then we start to think, what are the changes in the UN system in particular that we want to have, that could bring about a more effective, a better system that can address these challenges that Johan Röckström has outlined in Martin Heyer. So the first thing we thought about international environmental regimes. We had summarized all our findings about international treaties, our little incremental propositions on how treaties could be made better. But one core finding that came up in our discussion is what we really could go forward is introducing majority voting in more of these treaties. You have some treaties where majority-based rule is accepted. We believe this is the way forward to introduce this more and more in more and more international institutions and international organizations. We are not arguing in favor of one country, one vote, which is a normal UN modus operandi, because this is a system that you will not be able to use for very important decisions, because America and China and Brazil and other countries do not want to be overruled by Tuvalu and Kiribati. So therefore, you need a system of qualified decision-making, qualified votes, but there are examples in the international system, there are examples in local national systems, and we believe this is a major frontier for thinking and also for decision-making to move forward on this level. Secondly, we believe there are a number of areas out there where we just don't have institutions, but where new institutions are urgently needed. We mentioned water, we mentioned food, where we don't have global regimes. Most importantly, possibly, is the area of emerging technologies, where very smart scientists, supported by very smart business executives, sometimes by politicians, are developing new ideas, like on geoengineering, where we don't have any international framework in place that is dealing with these kind of challenges. And we believe it's important, not necessarily to ban this, it's not what we argue about. We argue for multilateral frameworks where countries and NGOs and all actors get together and discuss what is being developed and discuss what are the options that are available to deal with these kind of new emerging technologies. Secondly, thirdly, we also believe that it's important to upgrade the UN Environment Programme to a World Environment Organization. This is kind of has been discussed for 40 years. It's also the current standard position of the European Union. I have some slides about this later. And related to this, we also believe that change is needed for the CSD, the Commission on Sustainable Development, that was meant to integrate economic, social, and environmental pillars of sustainable development in '92. It was not effective. We believe new institutions in this area are needed. I come back to this later. Another point, we had long discussions about the main outcome from 2002, the Johannesburg Summit, which was public-private partnerships, multi-sectoral partnerships. There was a big hype from Johannesburg. It was labeled Type 2 because Type 1 intergovernmental conventions were not negotiable at that time. So everybody jumped on Type 2, and there was a huge hope that these kind of public-private partnerships could turn around things and can help to resolve implementation, representation, and other gaps in governance. And many of us have studied these issues. We had studied this in Holland, but also many groups in the United States, Bancashore in Yale, Jen Clapp in Toronto, many others. They have looked at this in quite some detail. What do we learn about public-private partnerships at the global level after 10 years, after 2002? And the general finding is pretty pessimistic. I mean, the core idea is, well, there are some partnerships that are effective. Some partnerships do a lot of important things, but as a governance mechanism that is really changing things, it will not work. In fact, we have built up a database of 330 partnerships where we try to analyze them statistically, and one finding is that a large part of these partnerships is not even existing. So you don't find any information. They are on the UN website, and you try to do research on them, they're just not there. It's kind of a new thing for political scientists that you analyze non-existing institutions. So this is kind of, I wouldn't say pessimistic is a strong word, but we believe this is not the way forward. We need stronger oversight and control of these entities, and we also believe that it must be clear that governments can't be let out of their responsibility by this privatization of global affairs. So we really believe that it's very important to underline this, that this is not the final solution for these issues. But then also related to this in a way, we also believe that if you think through all our proposals that I have presented so far, more are coming. So if you think them through, then we get more institutions and maybe also stronger institutions, because this is the bottom line that we are arguing for. This increases accountability and legitimacy problems of the global governance systems, because the more you give power to these kind of intergovernmental bodies, UN bodies, the more the question is, where are you guys? Where is civil society left? Where is the link between decision-making in New York or in Rome or Nairobi or wherever by great, but sometimes also not that visible members of the foreign offices, etc. So where is the link then to civil society? And how can we really hold these new bodies accountable? How can we guarantee the legitimacy? And this thing is one of the biggest challenges also to redefine democracy in a way at the global level. And so far, the UN operates more or less in the 19th century. This is a traditional mode of kings coming together and deciding for the populations. I'm a bit exaggerating here. I hope there's nobody from the UN here. Anyway, so we have to reinvent the system. We have to find new ways where civil society can be integrated in these ways of decision-making in a balanced way. And that's very important, because civil society is not equally distributed around the globe. It's focused in the north, it's mainly based in northern money. So many developing countries in particular have problems to see hundreds of white NGO representatives running around them and telling them what to do with their forest. So we have to find ways around this, and one way is we believe in finding new ways of civil society representation in these global institutions and organizations. Very important is, of course, also equity. And this is one point that in the northern debate, especially international relations research, is quite often forgotten. So we believe that it's very important to focus on the equitable distribution of costs and the outcomes of these kind of new governance mechanisms. And also we made it very clear that there is no way around increased financial transfers to poorer countries. It's sometimes in this country not that popular among some parties anymore, but we believe there's no way around to get a stable solution and stable protection of planetary boundaries without the willingness of the rich in the north, but also increasingly in some developing countries, to share and to support the poorest countries in mitigation and also in adaptation. And this leads to the final point of this policy brief, and this is kind of the pessimistic conclusion in a way, that we make all these nice proposals, but sometimes we had our doubts that they will work out, actually. So in a sense, we argue there should also be increasingly a plan B. Listening to the presentation with planetary boundaries, it might be that we are just too late and our efforts have been too little in the past, and that these trajectories we cannot stop anymore. So maybe we get a warming scenario from 2, 3, 4 degrees. So for this reason, I think it's also important in the international community, but also for countries, to play a leading role in developing new systems of global adaptation governance. Trying to think ahead, how could the UN system respond to a 4-degree warming scenario? I mean, the only reflects what the UN system has today is the Security Council. But this also lacks legitimacy, is probably not the most effective organ to deal with these kind of issues. So we have to think this through for migration, for food, for water, for health, and for many other issues that will tremendously affect especially the poorer parts, the bottom billion of humanity, and we have to find international institutions that can protect them, supported by national governance efforts. So what does this all lead us in the end? And this is a new step in our community. This is actually all based on research on the Earth System Governance Project that Kitty has mentioned. So it leads us, what we believe, increasingly believe, to the need to really address also core issues just in the fundamental hardwire of international institutions, the UN Charter. And this is one thing that our community has not done half a year ago. It's quite interesting, actually. I was used for the last 10 years, everybody said, this we can't do because we have to change the Charter, and nobody's ever changed the Charter, which is true. The Charter has never been changed except for some increases in the number of commissions or so. It has never been changed. Nobody has addressed this, actually, for a variety of reasons. But we believe, and this is based on a vision factory we had in Hakone, beautiful place, it was in hot springs, etc. So maybe this increased also the visions, whatever. You are sitting there in sulfur baths with very good Japanese food, and then really ideas flowed. But after 3 days soaking in these hot springs, we came to the conclusion that the UN Conference on Sustainable Development could be what we called a charter movement. It was actually also, there were some UN people also at that meeting, who said this is really a charter moment, the beginning maybe of a reform process that could lead to transformative change. And what could this be? And we had some ideas about this. We had some ideas about how really the Charter, if you really look from Article 1 to Article 116 it is, what are kind of the main stumbling blocks, where has this group of people who got this together in 1945, where it has to be adjusted for the realities that we have now of planetary boundaries, etc. So I would suggest, and this is a bit based on existing research, but also based on my own ideas, that there are 4 key elements where I could envision. Suppose we have a very energetic diplomatic core in these times, where I believe we could have a reformed UN system. And the one is, the important thing is integrating the economic and the environmental governance, which is now separate. Economic governance is done by the Bretton Woods institutions, partially also by the G20 and some other bodies, is essentially not really done in the UN system. There is an economic and social council in the UN system that was supposed to deal with these issues, but they don't. It has been outsourced to World Trade Organization and a number of other not really fully UN integrated organizations. There was the attempt in '92 with a Commission on Sustainable Development, which reports to the ECOSOC, which reports to the UN General Assembly. But this is, I think, what most observers believe is not entirely ineffective. I think nobody would be as brutal, maybe, but it's certainly not what kind of can deal with planetary boundaries in the 21st century sufficiently. So here, one proposal that came up for so many organizations is to have something new, which is like a UN Council on Sustainable Development. This is proposed by also the one report from Stephen Bernstein to the high-level panel. Some other organizations have come forward. What exactly it means is not really clear. It should not be the same as the CSD, just with a new name. So I think for me, one important part of it is decision-making. You need to have a decision. And many people talk about the G20 as a role model, because the G20, major industrialized economies, this represents 90% of global GDP and 65% or something of global population. So many people say, forget about the UN, the G20 can fix it. They get together in the nice bar, put them in a hot spring, and then all the world problems will be resolved. The problem is there are 170 nations, including the Netherlands, that are not happy with the solution, because they also want to raise the voice, no, from time to time in these matters. So therefore, I think what's important is to combine the two. To combine the broad legitimacy of the UN system, where all countries are somewhat represented, with a certain decision-making procedure that gives special role to the G20. So here the Arcona vision is to give the G20 in these kind of councils and other organizations a certain role as primary members that have a specific, a permanent position in a way, unless they lose their money and are no longer major economies, and also a stronger voting power, however you want to give it. Give them 50% of the vote, something like this, that allows such a body to be credible for China, Brazil, and United States, really accepted as something which is serious, which they don't believe ECOSOC and UNGA and other UN agencies are. So this is what is one idea that is being pushed around by a variety of actors. And I think here's a huge research need, because the idea, I think, finds broad support. What it means is still not really clear for many. So this is something to be discussed, where we also need to do more research. The second one is the environmental pillar. And this is United Nations Environment Program, set out in 1972, or 1973 actually, to be the environmental consciousness in the UN system. It's a program, it's not an organization. It's in this matter quite different from the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, World whatever meteorological organization, independent organization that can really set international standards, that have a certain authority in the UN system. This is what the United Nations Environment Program has not. So therefore, for the last 40 years, actors are proposing an upgrade of this agency. This is now the common line of the European Union. What I understand from the most recent intergovernmental dialogues, there was one in Solo in Indonesia in July, that more and more groups of countries are kind of converging around this idea to upgrade the United Nations Environment Program to something like a World Environment Organization that would be then similar to the International Labour Organization, World Health Organization. These are some of the models where they could stronger support norm-setting processes, centralize them to some extent, stronger support implementation processes, and also support the coordination of all the multilateral environmental treaties. There's no global governance area as chaotic as environmental policy. There was a joint inspection report from the UN, and these are kind of these super accountants from the UN system who have written some beautiful sentences, kind of also almost British, so it was done by Japanese anyway. So British, I mean, this is very unique in the UN system to have such a system in place, whatever. Because we have 900 treaties, they all have their different secretariats, they all have their different egos almost, and they all work sometimes together, but not always, and this is different from all other areas. So this is certainly one area where we can have more coordination and collaboration. Science. And this is an area which is also flying around in discussions that we need a better input of scientific information into global decision making. There's one idea from the from Stockholm-based IGBP people, it's not official, but from people on this network, to have a planetary ecologist, an idea that I find it's understandable, maybe a bit too radical in a way. I mean, who could this be? So other ideas are to have an intergovernmental panel on sustainable development, something that is overarching, that is cross-cutting all the IPCCs and IPBES, that is really able to bring all the knowledge together, understand all the planetary boundaries, assess all the information at a high level with an authoritative voice by independent people. So this is one model, are the IPCC type of assessment institutions. But I think another model, and this is what I find interesting also, that we have areas where governments and parliaments totally defer their decision making to experts, which is law. I mean, most countries have a Supreme Court that is deciding on the institution. And this is expert-led government in a way, depending on the country. But like in Germany, this is extremely strong, for example, where really decisions by parliaments are even overruled by experts, the judges. And you have the same also in central banks, where, what happens to the euro is delegated in a way to people who are just not responding to governments, really, independent central bankers. So why not have similar independent, authoritative bodies that have a certain autonomous, independent voice in the UN system? And this is one idea, could be supported. Leading experts, I mentioned Nobel Prize winners, all the people who have been in Stockholm, maybe some others also, because one issue with Nobel Prizes is always, they're all from Scandinavia. So you have either your Peace Nobel Prize is from Oslo, and the other ones is from Stockholm. Then you have the Volvo Prize for environmental science, which is again from Scandinavia. So that's kind of problems with selection bias, maybe, so whatever. So, anyways,
we're offering so much to the world.
Exactly. Yeah. So actually, I discussed this. Many people in developing countries, nobody complained about this ever. You have a huge bonus on legitimacy in these matters. Nobody's ever pointed this out, that this is essentially, Swedish actors who decide. There was never even a problem so far. Anyway, so it's good for Sweden. So maybe Holland should also get a prize going. So good. So this is kind of a little bit the idea to have such a body, design it in a certain way, and give it a clear role in the UN system. Like the International Court of Justice is a part of the UN Charter. It's really in the Charter since 1945 that there is this body, and this body is elected by people of high moral authority, experts in law, lawyers, whatever. And you cannot imagine something similar for the environment, where there is a, I call it sometimes, and it's even written here, Environmental Security Commission. That's a term, it's not the final term, but I think that's kind of a term to go with. And this was my one slide, and then I'm almost running through the last two slides, which is another idea that was pushed around since the 1990s, is a trusteeship council. And many of you know there is a trusteeship system in the UN which was meant for former colonies of Germany and the Ottoman Empire. And this all ended in 1974 when the last former colony, Palau, became independent. So then these guys decided we don't meet anymore. They couldn't abolish themselves because it's part of the charter. So there was this kind of empty room in New York. If you go there, beautiful room, totally empty. And then these ideas came up with Kofi Annan. He said, we should use this trusteeship. What is the modern trust? And the modern trust, he said, is global commons. So the idea came up to reform the trusteeship council for global commons. This idea never really took up that much. It was Kofi Annan and his advisors at the time, the Global Commission on Global Governance. And one reason is that nobody really can define what global commons are. And it's a very difficult thing to say climate is a global common. What does it mean for such a trusteeship council when you drive your car and you have your energy policy? How is it being dealt with? So therefore the idea kind of died off, but I think the idea makes sense for areas beyond national jurisdiction. And I think these are areas which is outer space, which is oceans and Antarctica. They are all governed by certain institutions, Antarctica Treaty, the UN Commission on Outer Space, there are a number of treaties. But I believe that conflicts about these areas will increase tremendously. I think Johan had already some slides of fishing and geoengineering, all kinds of stuff that will happen in the future in the high seas. Antarctica is kind of well governed, but only by 26 countries. Netherlands is part of them, and since now all 5 Dutch, I will move now to Antarctica, I heard, to keep up the Dutch flag and do research. So it's just kind of governed in a way, but you never know what the future is. So it makes also sense, if you think about UN reform, to also include these areas which are not governed by any country in a sort of a trusteeship council that at highest level in the UN system, people can think about it. So this is kind of 4 ideas how the charter could be reformed in the next 6 months. And and we had this term, this was based on our policy brief, that's based on Hakone, the charter movement or constitution movement. This is what we originally had in our policy brief, and journalists all picked up on it. They said, what do you mean with constitutional moment? And what we meant is an analogy in a way to 45. When the UN was set up, and look at this timeline, this was a period, it was 1 or 2 years, where almost every 3 months a new agency was set up. Diplomats were traveling around the globe and said, oh, World Health Organization, we need one. Oh, UNESCO, we need a culture organization. Oh, we need a trusteeship council and International Court of Justice. There was a time when the entire system that we have now was created in a very short period of time. And I like this photo very much. This is San Francisco. This is where the United Nations Charter was originally then agreed to. This is a Milford forest. It's this huge redwood forest area where then these people from this conference came together and met in these kind of 2,000-year-old trees. It's a very inspiring place. Sorry? Sorry? Yeah. Okay, sorry. See you together. Good. Good. We come back to this later. Anyways, this has been possible. Of course, it was linked to a war. We don't have a war, luckily, but just because there's no major war should not bear us from kind of totally revamp and revisit the entire system. So I think, in a sense, that change is possible. And I think also it is, I mean, of course, much needed. This is the two previous presentations. So I think that it's probably not likely that much change in the next 6 months, but there's certainly a way forward. And I feel a strong change in the scientific community, also among social scientists. We're kind of very established, reasonably conservative international relations professors, wake up and say, hey, we have to redo it all. No? And this was different 2 years ago. It has to do maybe with all these Anthropocene, planetary boundaries, so people are sufficiently nervous, as the economists would say, that people are really jumping out of the box and really saying things they have not said 5 years ago. Good, and just the background for our website, it's all from the Earth System Governance Project, and all of these discussions are on a variety of these websites and Facebook, where you become a fan of us now. Good, thank you so much.
Listening to these three excellent presentations, the question that was running through my mind is the one that General David Petraeus famously asked a Washington Post correspondent at the start of his first tour to Afghanistan. And his question was, tell me, how does this end? And this is the question with sustainable development that I really sort of zone out on, because I think until a few years ago, there were basically four main theories of change in the sustainable development movement about how this will all pan out over the long term. I think one school of thought, still the mainstream school of thought, at least in the European Union, is that it's a question of one last push. We move up to some kind of climactic summit, whether that's Kyoto or Copenhagen or Rio, one last push and we're going to get there. And unfortunately, it's, there's a lot of problems now with that school of thought. Look at the failure of Copenhagen, or the fact that the Doha round in the trade context has become this multilateral zombie, staggering on, moaning, never quite dying. And I think all of us are sort of losing faith a bit in the incremental theory of political change, but it's not yet clear what's ready to replace it. So that's one school of thought. I think across the Atlantic, the mainstream school of thought now is that it's technology and innovation that's how this plays out. So you see that kind of pledge and review school of thought that was so much in evidence at Copenhagen, the thinking of people like the Breakthrough Institute, that you don't need targets and timetables, we'll just innovate our way through this. But I think that's also a very problematic narrative that doesn't really have much evidence on its side. I think a third school of thought that we're hearing more from now is another very bottom-up school of thought that thinks in terms of new designs for living. This is things like the permaculture scene or the transition towns movement that's come out of peak oil thinking. Very localization focused, very interested in kind of what happens at the grassroots, but doesn't always have a big picture of systemic global change to go with it. And then I think the fourth school of thought that you hear about sometimes is what I call the Collapsitarians, the people who say, we're not going to make it, we're going to be losing, significant chunks of the human population. There was a lot of this around in the 1970s with people in the kind of population explosion kind of school of thought. And I don't think any of these four schools of thought really has the answer on how this plays out. So what are we left with? And my answer on this, which I think is now starting to filter out a lot more in the last few years, is that the point about unsustainability is that it's not sustainable, it won't last. And so increasingly it will drive shocks and turbulence, and that those shocks create moments of political opportunity. And that's really, for me, the key to the kind of theory of change about how this story plays out. If you look over the last decade, the one that ended 2 years ago, it's a decade that was very much bookended by shocks. You had 9/11 at one end of the decade, and at the other end of the decade, the food and fuel price spike, and of course, the financial crisis. And after each of those shocks, it was striking that there were suddenly, and only quite briefly, windows of opportunity when for a little while, it was possible to think the unthinkable, to really think on a much larger stage about options for change. And this is very much in keeping with my favorite quotation of all time, which is Milton Friedman, the monetarist economist, who wrote a letter to his fellow monetarists in the mid-70s, when no one had ever heard of them, saying that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And he said to his colleagues, that, as I see it, is our basic function, to keep the ideas alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable, which I think is a tremendously powerful theory of change. And the right wing in the United States is very good at this theory of change. The monetarists played that like a flute at the end of the 1970s. The neocons did the same thing after 9/11. Just fantastic opportunism to say, well, have you thought of invading Iraq as a policy option? They were ready to move into that space. And it's something that kind of progressives and people who work on sustainable development haven't always come to as naturally, but I think we're starting to do it. And if you look at books like Paul Gilding's book, The Great Disruption, it's very much in this line of thinking that shocks create space and we have to be ready to use those moments of readiness. There's a story I always liked from when I worked in the British government that back in 1999, after the Southeast Asian economic crisis, a man called Jeff Mulgan, who was then Tony Blair's head of policy at Number 10, was going around Downing Street going, you know, if we could just have had a plan ready on the shelf for reform of global financial architecture, we could have had it done within 6 weeks after the Asian economic crisis. But we didn't have a plan ready and the moment of opportunity closed. And hey presto, 10 years later, Lehman Brothers collapses, and now all my friends in the progressive NGO movement are going, oh, what a shame we didn't have a plan ready for reform of global financial architecture, because we could have done it in the 6 weeks after Lehman Brothers collapsed. So I think that the question we should all be obsessing about is, what are the determinants of readiness? What enables us to anticipate and prepare for those moments of opportunity, even if we can't predict exactly what form they'll take or when they'll happen? And I think there are 4 X factors that determine whether we, as people pushing for sustainable development, will be able to use those shocks. The first one is about institutional bandwidth, and I want to associate myself with a lot of the ideas that Frank set out in his presentation, because clearly we have a very low bandwidth set of institutions. If you were going to design from scratch an institution to manage a problem as complex as climate change, you would not start on a blank sheet of paper with something that looks like the UNFCCC. And so I think although there's an objection doing the rounds to the idea of a council on sustainable development, saying, why is this going to be any different to the Commission on Sustainable Development? Well, I think the answer to that is that in current political conditions, probably it won't be that different. But this is about creating the bandwidth for when the political space opens up. And at that point, the fact that we have the right institution available will be tremendously important. And that's why I think that's worth looking at. I think a second element of readiness is about the policy content. Thinking through the what-ifs. What would we push for if for 6 weeks only we had 10 times as much political space on climate change as any of us have ever seen in our whole careers? I enjoy asking this question to heads of advocacy at NGOs or chief negotiators on climate delegations. And it's striking that we rarely stop to ask ourselves these questions. But imagine if you had a climate impact that was equivalent to a Lehman Brothers moment. It's not a systemic disaster, but it's close enough to make everyone stop and really take a sharp intake of breath. What would we push for on climate change in that situation? Because I think the risk is that when you live and breathe in a process like the UNFCCC, progress is so glacial. You spend 7 years trying to get Kyoto into force, and even then countries start leaving once it is in force, that you self-censor. You're always trying to be realistic, so you just focus on how should we improve the rules for the clean development mechanism in the second commitment period, and we don't ask the big picture what-ifs. And I think that's something we need to change. I think the third element of readiness is all about coalitions. I think there's good arguments that when you have a big crisis, sometimes the right leaders come along. But a coalition is something that takes longer to assemble. You can't wait for the moment of crisis to start building the coalitions that are going to push for these policy options. And I think in that regard, the kind of multi-stakeholder coalitions that we're seeing assemble in the run-up to Rio are really important. There's a lot of cynicism about the Type 2 partnerships that came out of WSSD, that not much actually happened as a result, and that's probably true. But both companies and NGOs have come on so far in the last 10 years, companies particularly thinking much more systemically and much less just about kind of the voluntarism of CSR, that I think multi-stakeholder partnerships are now in a very different place. And so, again, we need those coalitions in place to be pushing for the big picture policy options when opportunity knocks. But I think the fourth and final and the most important element of readiness for me is all about narratives and stories, because this is fundamentally about politics, first and foremost. And I think this is something that in sustainable development we've often tripped up on, that we think that that if we persuade people on the basis of the evidence and the economics and the policy options, that will win people over. But actually, if you look back at the period since the Stockholm Environment Conference in '72 and say, what is the single thing that's done most to change attitudes about the environment? I think without hesitation, it's pictures taken of the Earth from space with the Apollo missions. It wasn't evidence, it was an image, a metaphor, a narrative, a story. And that's where we should be investing a lot of our effort. Because as we go into this period of tremendous turbulence and confusion, which is going to be scary a lot of the time, there's a real risk that the default narratives that people may reach for are going to be ones that make our task harder rather than easier. Narratives about collapse, about Malthus, that there isn't enough space for all of us, so we have to compete for the resources that are available. Environmentalists sometimes refer to humanity as a cancer. We've probably all heard that. These are not empowering narratives. But the thing is that we're at this interesting moment in history where 50 years ago we had all sorts of authority figures who we would have looked to for stories about where we were going as a society. We trusted our politicians more, we trusted the media more, we were much more likely to go to church. Those messengers have fallen away, and so now it's actually down to all of us to be thinking in these big picture terms. And if I can just leave you in closing with one thought about a narrative that we should be propagating, it's the narrative of fair shares, which I think is much more resonant language than equity, which is quite a technical thing and it immediately leads into disputes about competing visions of equity. Everyone knows what a fair share is. You grow up with it as a child when you're going, he's got more than me, about slices of cake. And this actually, for me, is the single biggest impediment to progress on all of these multilateral issues that are currently stalled. Above all, when you get to the safe operating space within planetary boundaries. Of course, it's going to play out in different ways with different boundaries. The way we share out carbon space within a safe climate boundary is going to be very different to how we share out fresh water, which is going to be much more regional a lot of the time. But if there's a common theme across all of these things, it's that we should be pushing the message that equity and fair shares is about per capita shares. It's not about equity in terms of your share of the global economy. It's not about one country, one vote. It has to be in terms of equal per capita shares to these natural resources. That has an intuitive appeal to it. It's been an idea that's kind of materialized sometimes, but never decisively in the climate negotiations. But the reason that, for instance, the US and the emerging economies won't talk Turkey about climate is because everyone's skirting around this equity issue. So I think actually to be putting ideas on the table and saying, this is the interpretation of equity that actually makes intuitive sense to people, that is something that can help us forward when these moments of opportunity open up. I'll stop there.
If we really want to do something on this planet, it should be formal, informal, non-formal, all the learning from all individuals lifelong. So why wasn't the change in the educational systems in one of the presentations?
I am personally dubious about the idea of relying on crises to precipitate systemic change. But to avoid giving a statement myself, I'm just going to ask the other panelists to say what they think.
I think some of the issues mentioned were that we miss education, social equity and fair share issues, the Arctic region and the basically Principle 10, the participatory and accountability issue.
Point about education mission is well taken, but on the other hand, if you do not talk about technologies as artifacts, but as something that relates to social, you talk about education. I mean, when you say we need to learn from the Green Revolution in order to get that maximum yield back on the table, you talk about education, so it's built into it. The other thing is, I suppose, what you emphasized rightly is the idea that education is not only a formal thing but an informal thing. And what I find interesting at this moment, from being director at PBL and having all these liaisons with academics elsewhere, we're all crossing boundaries. We're all trying to find ways to relate to audience in different ways, whether it is through the internet, whether it is through other media, fact sheets, Twitter, whatever. And Twitter and all these social media are educational vehicles. We exploring how to do that in an effective way. So in that sense, we're not unimaginative, but probably we could be helped with lots of good advice. The only other thing I think I should touch upon before I hand back the mic is this issue of crises. Because, I mean, we know that public administrators love the idea of crisis. I mean, they say, if only we would have a crisis. But obviously, in terms of, say, that being a persuasive theory of social change, that's another matter. I mean, the Euro crisis, how much further do we want to get to a crisis? And surely we have a 10-point plan on what needs to be done. It is not done. So why don't we learn in these situations? It's not that we don't have the plan ready. It is much more complex than that. And I suppose the idea of a political decision in itself should be put into a sociological perspective. That is that politics is often the closing stone of something that is already materially there in society. The idea that politics takes the lead, I think I would take issue with. I mean, it is that there is such a push out of society to go in a particular direction that makes it possible for politicians to do the things that need to be done. It's not that the ideas are not there per se.
Well, I'll combine a couple of these issues. And I'd like to start on education because I think the point is very important. It's likewise important, though, to recognize that education is what I would call a slow variable. It plays out in the generational time step rather than in the 6 months we have to change the UN Constitution. But it's an absolute necessity because it's the only factor we know that can, for example, influence the absolute necessity of not going beyond 9 billion people on this planet, for example. So we need to invest in both sides. And I would argue that the most pertinent area, two areas where we need to invest in education is to train a next generation of young scholars thinking in inter and transdisciplinary ways. And we also need to train a new generation of economists. Because that's an area that has proven so inadequate to deal with the challenges we're facing, and in fact obsolete in many areas. So I think that's one very important investment. Then on crisis, I mean I'm very supportive of the empirical evidence that we see crisis as being a source of innovation. We do a lot of own research on transition pathways showing time and time again that crisis can be used as an opportunity. The difficulty we're facing here is that this is the first time in human history when we are facing crisis that cannot be allowed to occur. So we've been very good at allowing Europe to be completely raised out of the social maps after world wars, and we've used that as an opportunity to rebuild. But you cannot refreeze the Greenland ice sheet. Nobody knows how to do it, not even Electrolux, even though it's a wonderful Swedish company. I didn't think about that. So we're in this enormously new situation where we know that we have crises that can occur, but we have to navigate ourselves free from them occurring. And one illustrative example of the dilemma we have, because we won't know when this may occur. I mean, a couple of months back, something very shocking occurred when, for the first time ever, an ozone hole was observed in the Arctic. And it was totally wrong. I mean, it was one of those moments where, it was wrong time of the year and it should not be possible in the Arctic 20 years after we successfully implemented the Montreal Protocol. What is happening? Well, most likely it's simply that our sins from 30 years ago is biting us in the back and combining with global warming, because the theory of global warming shows that when the atmosphere warms, the stratosphere cools. So you have a cooler than expected stratosphere, and you still have chlorofluorocarbons playing around, and you suddenly get an Arctic ozone hole 30 years after the proof was on the table. So it's just to show that, you know, we're in a crisis mode which is completely different than anything in the past. So I think there is a lot of support to what Frank is saying, but at the same time, I think your point that some crisis we cannot allow to happen at this time. Finally, on the three pillars, I find I'm one of, we have supported the three pillars. That the Stockholm Environment Institute originates from the whole thinking around the three pillars of sustainable development. Still, I think they actually do not help us in this round of development, because I think we simply have to do like kids do, you know, when they play with round circles or like Russian dolls, that we simply have to recognize that the economy is a subset of the environment. And it's simply so that I mean, to put it in governance terms, any prime minister or heads of state should probably appoint their environment ministers as their top aides to rule the finance minister, who should in turn rule the other ministers. And to put that hierarchy right, which of course is a total utopia today, but it's just to show that, you know, we cannot continue with this dialogue of having the environment and the social and the economic as being three kind of trade-off parts of the playing field. Of course, we have to address them integrally, but we also need to recognize that the economy must be working within the environmental space. And that might be better portrayed then not as three pillars, but more thinking beyond environment, as someone suggested, which I think is very good. So shutting down the ministries for the environment and ramping up some kind of broader ministry for human development.
Well, I think I like this point about education very much. I mean, also speaking a bit, I mean, I think it's also important in these kind of panels to make it personal in a sense, because I'm involved in all levels of education as a father and as a university person. And I think for schools, I think it's extremely important that they play a role, and the current trend is against it. I think schools have to be organized in a way that kids learn, I mean, that consumption is not everything. And right now, this is not really part of any curriculum. I mean, everything is focused in this country on mathematics and the language. That's kind of it. I mean, beating the Chinese. And I think there's another way to organize schools, and something that's very important. And the other part of education, I think, is very important, which is quite well done here in this country, also in Sweden, is this non-conflictive way of dealing with issues. And I think this is, if you read of all these stories, the current statistics, these are kind of the happiest countries. I mean, both Netherlands and Sweden. I think Sweden is a bit more happy, actually, which has to do with trust. It has to do with a non-conflictive approach to life. Because this is important, because whatever happens, if you think about fair share, if you think about shocks and disasters, whatever might happen, we need these resources. We need the social capital in a way to deal with all kind of things that might happen, including redistribution. I mean, this is what we have now in the European Union with North versus South, and this is what we also will have more increasingly. If you think about fair per capita, this will cost money to the North. I think there's no way around. And I think this is important. Our societies are prepared to accept these responsibilities on a global level, and this is where education comes in. And for universities, it's the same stories that also universities have to live what they're preaching, and not necessarily doing it so far. I mean, we're thinking about it, I mean, but I think universities have to be leaders in the sustainability revolution, and we're not yet there. I mean, people think about it, and we have lots of commissions on trying to, I mean, my university wants to be carbon neutral in, I think, 20 years or so, which they will do by offsetting, of course. But there is a lot of stuff is being happening in this field. I think it's very important for people. I mean, there's sometimes these sustainability professors who write big books about sustainability reform, and then they have 5 SUVs at home, whatever. I think these are not necessarily always role models. No good. I mean, talking about the Arctic, I mean, this I didn't include because it's not necessarily an area beyond jurisdiction, except for, I mean, certainly an issue of huge conflicts. I mean, this is really where global change hits the ground. But it's not, I mean, the high seas, I mean, it's part of the high seas in this matter. I mean, either it is under national jurisdiction, belongs to whatever, Norway or Canada or whatever, or it is high seas, but then it is seas, it's frozen water. So it's different from Antarctica, which is a continent. That's why I've kind of had this different system. But it is kind of in this trusteeship to the extent that it is beyond the EEC zone, then it is kind of a part of this vision.
Setting up a treaty for the Arctic as well?
Oh, this I think it's a great idea. But this was different from this trusteeship idea for areas beyond. I mean, for me, it was very important to make this differentiation between there are areas beyond, within national jurisdiction, and areas which are beyond. And this particular idea, It doesn't mean that we should not have a treaty on the Arctic, but this particular idea was focused on areas beyond, which is everything. I mean, if you look at whatever international law works, everything, I mean, outer space, nobody really knows where it starts, because the air is part of the country and outer space is part of the global community. And there are, I think, 60 different theories where outer space starts. It's fascinating stuff, never looking at whatever, so it's really good. But anyway, so that's what for the Arctic. Catastrophes, I mean, there is a literature out there. I mean, like if you look at marine policy, for example, the negotiation of treaties on marine pollution was always after a tanker. It was a tanker, a treaty, a tanker, a treaty. Even the first treaty on the safety of life at sea was done after Titanic. I mean, Titanic started this entire international cooperation. So there is a trajectory. But of course, I would not hope that this is the situation. I believe, I like always to read this public administration literature on policy windows, and I really think, I mean, this is what it's kind of, there is a certain element of truth. We just don't have a policy window, but if there is a policy window at some point, then we have to be ready with ideas and proposals, and also have found some consensus maybe in the community.
Yeah,
because that's,
if I might, you don't want to wait until there's no backup.
no, definitely not. No. I mean, I think actually some of the, I think like especially the planetary boundaries idea is really catching on. I mean, this is one of the narratives that have been mentioned. I think these are, I mean, there are others also, but I think like Spaceship Earth in 1970s and 60s, and now this boundaries imaginary is really maybe helping people and creating a momentum without a disaster. Because this is what you want to have in a sense. You want to have momentum for change. You want to have a policy window where all politicians say this is extremely important because of the citizens, of course. The citizens have to start and politicians have to say this is really important, and this moment you want to reach without having all kinds of disasters that might come if you follow Johan's graphs. What I liked, I mean, fair share, I'm fully agree. I think that's very important. I think the term fair share itself, there are still different interpretations possible. Like grandfathering, I mean, that's kind of the American vision on how you divide things. I mean, if you have a lot of emissions already, then you can continue them. That's kind of the basic idea of grandfathering. It is, I mean, I'm against it, but it relates to things like inheritance. The entire inheritance system in countries is based on the idea if your father and your mother is rich, you're also rich. It's kind of the same idea. I'm against this in both for inheritance and for climate. But I think this is, there are rationales, there are kind of traditions out there that things are just being transferred to further generations. I love the idea of per capita. I think this is one thing for Europe actually, to really get out there and say to the Chinese and say on principle we agree on per capita. Doesn't mean tomorrow. But if you say on the long term, whatever 2050, whatever, construction convergence, if this signal comes, then you have this kind of statement, this is the fairness principle that we accept. And we know from some, like the World Trade Organization is one of these examples where simple ideas and simple principles are convincing. It's, I mean, the entire agreement is 400 pages, but it's just 2 or 3 very basic principles. And if countries just agree and the citizens agree, fair share means every person gets the same, whatever, wherever you are. And if you consume so much, it's your problem, then you have to get down. And this is a consequence, either by technology or by kind of burning your car or whatever. So this is kind of, but I think this fair share and per capita can have be a tremendous narrative that might even be able to block deadlocks. But Europe has to be the current, because they don't do it really. You know, so kind of somewhat they agree on it, but nobody really makes a unilateral declaration and says, hey guys, we accept fair capita if you guys also accept it by 2000 and something. What's it? And participation, I don't know who said it, I think is tremendous, it's extremely important. I mean, we have the UN system is, as I mentioned, I believe in my presentation, is based on the 19th century. And we have, this is kind of very much is diplomacy driven by governments, and increasingly so by the executive branch of government. I mean, parliaments are sometimes running around there, but they're not really playing a major role. It's really run by the ministries. And so there is a problem. I mean, how can we really hold these mechanisms accountable? In Rio, there was this idea of major groups, which was meant to break up the problem of defining what is civil society. But this is the biggest issue is, what is civil society? I mean, there are some people out there, they have great NGOs behind them and just one person. So then you ask, I mean, who is standing behind? They said, oh, it's just me, whatever. So, I mean, this kind of depends a lot about how well you're talking, how good you're writing, how good you are on Facebook. So this is kind of a very difficult way on giving political power to an amorphous thing like a civil society. Then they came with major groups, 9 major groups. But it's also, I mean, they have whatever youth and they have indigenous people. I mean, but I mean, the question also, why these 9 groups? I mean, they have the youth, but they don't have the elderly, no? So whatever. So I mean, I'm kind of out of all of these 9 groups actually. So good. And I think it's kind of, I'm not indigenous really. I'm not whatever. So anyway, so not a farmer, and they have the farmers, but they don't have the. I'm science. Oh no, science. Science is there. One of the major groups is science. I made it. No. Anyway, so there are lots of discussions about this. I don't want to. But I believe, I mean, to cut it short, I believe in chambers of civil society. I mean, that's what I would say. So sorry.
I was going to say actually 2 things on fair shares and 1 on crises. The 2 things on fair shares are, one is that I think we have to explain why limits are a total game changer for discussions about fair shares. We've just had 250 years where the only thing left and right agreed on was that the cake of resources to be shared out was expanding year on year. And that puts a particular flavour on arguments about distribution. You can have arguments about trickle down, saying, okay, it's very unequal, but the poor people are better off than they would have been thanks to the rich people generating all this growth. Once you have limits in the equation, it is impossible to argue that, because more for the people who are best off, by definition, means less for the people who are worse off. And once you have limits, that's why I think the only fair share you can have is per capita. So that's one of the thoughts about fair shares. And you can still argue this, incidentally, in a way that doesn't make you sound like a raving socialist. If you look at the China Dialogue website this week, the new head of the World Watch Institute, sensible American environmental think tank, has a piece saying, here's a new proposal for a global climate deal which eradicates the distinction between developed and developing countries and enables everyone to consume as many emissions as you like. And what he's arguing for is contraction and convergence. He's saying you eradicate the line between developed and developing by having equal per capita shares. And how does everyone have all the emissions they like? By buying other people's entitlements. Free market appeals to the US, and yet it's still contraction and convergence. The second point about fair shares is I think that when anyone says, when you argue for fair shares, that you're in favor of redistribution, it's always worth pushing back and saying, no, it's pre-distribution because the property rights haven't been created yet. If you look at the 9 planetary boundaries, property rights only exist for a handful of them. Land, obviously, there are property rights. But if you look at the atmosphere, we haven't really done that sharing out of global assets yet. If you look at fresh water, again, typically the property rights don't exist. So when people say, again, that the metaphor for arguing for fair shares is that you're a socialist, you say, no, the metaphor is enclosure in 19th century England, where the large landowners are grabbing the land and taking it away from poor people. It's a different proposition altogether. In terms of not wanting to rely on crises, I couldn't agree more. By all means, let's keep doing all the stuff we're doing now. I don't think we're getting a great dividend from it, but let's absolutely not stop. I'm not arguing for us relying on crises, I just want us to stop wasting them. Because crises are such fertile soil for change. And that's so true in global governance particularly. You have an oil shock in 1973, you get an International Energy Agency in what becomes the G8. You have the Second World War, you get the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions. You have the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, you get the whole concept of national sovereignty. This is really the kind of the great incubator of institutional innovation. And it's just that I don't want us to fritter those opportunities and miss the chance this time round. Oh, and one other thing. In terms of Johann's point that the thing with the scale of global change we're looking at now is that we can't afford to have the crises. I agree with that 100%, but that's why I think it's not one perfect storm that we're waiting for. It's rather that we're already seeing lots of perturbations, more severe and frequent disasters, as we know, and each one of those has a moment of opportunity after it. I think in the United States we saw the moment of opportunity after Hurricane Katrina. That was capitalized on, to some extent at least. Whereas the heat wave in Russia, the floods in Pakistan, were not well capitalized on. So it's not one perfect storm somewhere in our future and putting all of our chips on that. I think it's using every single one of these shocks more creatively and intelligently than we're doing at the moment.
We have the triple F crisis: fuel, food, and financial. if the rate of biodiversity change reflected your stocks, you would not sleep. We have droughts, floods, and tornadoes. We have population growth, we have displacements, and we have growing inequities. And how come we, as societies, and that means private sector, politicians, civil society, all of us together, how come we do not panic in the face of so much evidence? I just don't get it. And so, well, no, it is not too big. Because if it is too big and if it is too complex, we already accept failure. And I refuse to accept failure, but I need you guys to raise the awareness, to engage in the context of the National Platform for Rio+20, with me, with my politicians, because unless we start to see this growing community of people that really want ambitious and tangible change in Rio, it's not going to happen. Have you heard one politician speak about Rio? Do you see headlines in the papers?
Not yet.
It is not yet there, so I need you and I'm calling on you to keep coming to these events, to please engage with us in the context of the website for the National Platform, and to be my partner for change. Because as I think Martin was saying, we need, what was it, new messages, more engagement, and new messengers for change. You are them. Thank you very much for being here.